Hi class, in this video we're going to go over chapter 23, 22, inflation. All right, so before I talk about the actual content, let's talk about this picture here. So what you see here in front of you is real money. Um, it was used in Zimbabwe. This face value, if you can count all the zero behind it, it says $100 billion. So this was a lot of money. Actually, you know what? One reason behind that was that um, the country of Zimbabwe was having a little inflation problem in the year 2008. The inflation got so bad that the government decided that instead of printing out more money to keep up with the inflation, that they have decided to print out new money to keep up with the inflation. So the smallest bill in the country, it changed from $1 to $1,000 to $1 million, and then by the summer of 2008, the smallest bill was it was $1 billion. So basically means that anybody who had any money was a billionaire. But that didn't make you rich, because imagine you go to the store, you want to buy a loaf of bread, and that loaf of bread will cost you $3 billion. So literally, there were many starving billionaires in the country, and that was because the country was having a little inflation problem. So the biggest face value of this currency was valued at $100 trillion with a T behind it. That's even more than what you see over here. If you guys now, of course, the money is not in circulation anymore. It's not used anymore. The country has, by the end of 2008, has replaced those crazy big dollars with smaller face values. But if you want, you can purchase that $100 trillion, $100 trillion Zimbabwe dollar on eBay, and it will cost you about maybe $100 to $150, depends on who the seller is, right? So if you guys have any, family or friends who are impossible to buy a gift for, get them this $100 trillion Zimbabwe dollar, right? So that's the biggest face value of any currency in the world. Okay, now how much was that money really worth? Well, the thing is, nobody really knows for sure, because even though the official exchange rate at one point was 621 million Zimbabwe dollar to $1, but there wasn't much exchange going on. That because nobody was willing to give up US dollar for this worthless Zimbabwe dollar. And that's why even at $100 trillion, it still wasn't worth that much, right? So, but if you guys want, you can purchase the real $100 trillion Zimbabwe dollar on eBay, and that's a pretty nice souvenir. Okay, all right. So let's talk about inflation. So what is inflation? Inflation is anytime you have an increase in the average price level. That's called inflation. Now, it doesn't mean that everything is getting more expensive. It just means the average of all the prices are getting more expensive. So you might still have something getting cheaper in an inflationary period. But overall, the average prices of everything is getting more expensive, and that's called inflation. And then for this inflation, it's measured by using basket of goods and services. So imagine that we have let's say your own weekly consumption, right? So you go to your grocery store, Walmart, Target, H-E-B, and you put everything in the basket. Now that basket will be kept consistently from week to week. And you're going to compare to see how much is the change of the value of the same basket. So if your basket is getting more expensive, that's an inflation, right? So really, inflation is measured not by looking at one or two goods, it's by looking at a basket of the same good from one time to next point, and that's called inflation. So that's the measurement by using index number. So our US inflation is also using index number. It's called a CPI, Consumer Price Index. To measure this inflation, we're going to choose a base here. So arbitrary year, so let's say 1984, that's the number our country uses. So between 1982 to 1984, we choose as the base year. So anything more than the base year, if it's anything more than 100, which is the value for the base year, that's the inflation. And anytime if it's less than 100, that's, we call it deflation. This is how I think about it, right? So let's suppose we're looking at how tall you are. But instead of looking at, what is your height in terms of, feet and inches, but we're going to look at your height as a growth rate, as a comparison. So we're going to say, hey, your height at age 12, we're going to call that 100. And then if your height is ever going up, you're going to be more than 100. That means, hey, you're growing taller. But even though we don't know how tall you are, but we know that you're growing taller, right? So it's the same concept of inflation. So we don't know how much this basket is, and that's actually irrelevant because everybody have different basket. But we do know how much the basket value has increased from 1 year to next year, right? That's the idea of index. And then to find this inflation rate, we're going to use the index number for this year minus last year and divided by last year times, this is a little typo here, so make sure you know this. So times 100%, because inflation is a percentage. All right, so CPI. CPI stands for Consumer Price Index. So this is the most widely adopted measurement of inflation for by the U.S. government. And the CPI it consists of basket of different goods and services that a typical consumer will purchase on a monthly basis. So think about your groceries, your food, your clothes, your entertainment, transportation. Those will be all part of our consumer price index. So this is the most widely used, but it is not perfect. So a couple problems. The biggest problem for CPI is something called a substitution bias. That this goes down to this fixed basket. The CPI assume that our basket never change, even though consumer might change behavior. Right. So for example, let's suppose every month, every week, you always buy proteins, so meat. So you're going to buy a mixture of chicken, beef, and pork. And let's suppose if the price for beef is getting more expensive, then as a typical consumer, that when the beef getting more expensive, according to law of demand, we're going to buy less beef. At the same time, that because let's say chicken is a substitute of beef, then when the beef getting more expensive, holding every sales constant, consumer are going to be buying more chicken. So there will be a switch from beef to chicken, and that's a behavior change. So what consumer will purchase in the basket will be changed in the amount of beef and chicken. But CPI doesn't care about that. CPI still assume that even though beef getting more expensive, consumer will be buying the same amount of beef and chicken. So the basket never change, even though consumer change behavior, right? So that's the first problem. Second problem also goes back to this same basket. So it's the fixed basket of goods and services. So whenever you have, let's say, a new good that's introduced in the economy, well, it's hard for our CPI to calculate that. Now, normally we don't think too much about any introduction of new goods because there wouldn't be a big impact of consumer spending. But if you look at the spending of any categories, so let's say entertainment, music consumption. So think about how did you spend money, purchase music last year? I mean, anybody bought a CD or cassette or vinyl? I know a lot of you bought vinyl last year, right? Because so much so that there's actually a shortage of vinyl in the country. But what we do with that purchase consumption of music, it changed from time to time, right? So in the 1970s, everybody purchased vinyl. 1980s, cassette was the big deal. Remember, if you look at all the 80s movies, all the cool guys, right, have those big boombox on their shoulder. That's a cassette player. And 1990s become the CD, and then 2000s was the iPod, and then I don't know. Now you guys listen to Spotify. You don't even pay for anything anymore, right? So that's change of behavior. Those new good, those new purchase, new type of good, is difficult for CPI to incorporate into the next calculation. And also, if you ever have a change of quality, so something is getting better, and that's why it's more expensive, right? So let's say if you buy a car, so if you buy a car back in 1980, now that car might have a cassette player, it probably have an AC in there, but I don't think it'll have any power window, power lock, it wouldn't have any ABS brakes, and then for sure there wouldn't be any GPS in it. But if you buy a new car today, it will have a GPS, ABS brakes, satellite radio. So of course it's a better car, and therefore it's more expensive. But because one reason because it's a better car, that's why it's more expensive. But CPI says, hey, we don't care about the better quality. All we see is that it's higher prices, and therefore because of the substitution bias and the unmeasured quality change, CPI tend to overstate how much the true inflation is. But CPI is still the most widely used measurement of the inflation in America. So if you look at our typical CPI, so it's divided by different portions. So the biggest spending in CPI is housing. Now remember, CPI measures the spending of a typical US consumer. So for most US household, we spend about 40% of our overall monthly spending on housing. That can be rent, mortgage, property tax, fixing the houses. So those will be all part of housing. And then depends on where you are in the country, the number 2 and 3 category might switch places, but typically number 2 will be transportation, number 3 might be food and beverage, but those two are very close to each other, right? So between food and beverage, transportation and housing, that's about little over 70% of a typical consumer's monthly spending. All right, so also know what's a core inflation index. So the core inflation index is followed very closely by many economists. The difference between our CPI and then the core inflation index, think about what is measured in CPI. Everything, right? So all the spending by consumers is measured in CPI. But there are some spending in the consumer, or there are some spending in the monthly, there are some categories in the monthly spending of consumers that can be very volatile. Doesn't really indicating how good or how bad the economy is. Might just be changes due to some unpredicted variables that we have no control of. And to be honest, the economists don't care that much about. So for example, let's suppose there is a hurricane, let's say Hurricane Katrina, that went through the Gulf of Mexico and then went through Louisiana. That was a very, very bad disaster for the U.S. economy, also for many people living in the area. But that little disaster actually caused a very quickly increase in the oil prices. Now, if you're a consumer, that's a big impact on your monthly spending. But for most economists, we're looking at this increase in oil spending. We think, hey, that's bad, but it's only temporary, because once the hurricane's over, once everything's back to normal, the price for oil, the price for gasoline will drop back down because we're back to normal, right? So that little kick shouldn't be included in our long-term decision-making process, because we cannot expect that every September we'll have a Katrina. I mean, it's happening pretty often now because of climate change, but economists don't expect that every single year, right? So to avoid counting those volatile changes, such as energy, food prices, then this core inflation index will calculate almost everything except energy and food prices, because those tend to be more volatile and changes that's outside of our economic control. So there are some solutions. There are solutions for the shortcoming of CPI. So our Bureau of Labor Statistics, also known as the BLS, this is the agency that keeps track of our CPI and also many other economic variables in the economy. If you guys interested, go to the website called the bls.gov. You can see some very interesting economic data point in it. Well, I say interesting because I'm an economist. Almost everybody else find it very boring. Okay, but if you're interested in economics, take a look at it. So bls.gov. So BLS actually use many alternative mathematical methods to calculate CPI. So we try to update the basket as frequently as possible, so to avoid any substitution bias. And but still, it still happens. So on average, the CPI tend to overstate our true inflation by about 0.5 percentage per year, right? So still not perfect, but we're doing everything we can to make it perfect. All right, so a couple more. So also known as a producer price index. So CPI measures the spending by the consumer. PPI measures the spending by the producers. And then one good thing about the producer price index is because if you know how much the producers are paying for to manufacturing these goods and services, that means more than likely, in the very near future, when they turn around, sell this good to consumers, to be charging a higher price as well. So CPI give you a very good estimate of your current inflation. PPI tend to give you a very good estimate of your very near future inflation, because when the producer pays more, they're going to charge a higher prices on consumers. And then there's something called also an international price index. So this measures the price level in the import-export. That's an impact on our GDP. We talked about this in the previous chapters. Remember, GDP goes to C plus I plus NX, the net export, right? So when you do have these changes in the international price index, that will have an impact on your net export and also impact on your overall GDP measurement. There's also the employment cost index, measures the cost of wages paid in the labor market. Normally, economists don't pay too much attention to this one because it doesn't change that much. But with the pandemic, since COVID, there's been a labor shortage. So there's been some pretty dramatic increases in the employment cost index. And lastly is our GDP deflator. So we talked a little bit about this in the previous chapters when we mentioned about the nominal GDP, the real GDP, right? So the difference between our nominal GDP and real GDP, that's your GDP deflator. And GDP deflator can be used to calculate inflation as well. All right, so we did have some very high inflation in the US history. So right after World War I, right after World War II, and also in the 1970s, we had very high inflation. And then really back in 1970s, remember in your US history class, we had the oil embargo, that the many countries in Middle East stop exporting oil to America. That caused an oil shortage and also caused an inflation, and that was actually called stagflation, right? So if you don't know what it is, go Google it, but you should have learned this term in your US history class. So stagflation is whenever you have high inflation and a high unemployment. So that was very high inflation in US history. Most recently in 2021, 2022, we had a pretty high inflation. So in 2021, 2022, our inflation was about 9 to 10% per year. That was the highest since 1980, so it's pretty high. But now today's 2023, we're down a lot. So so most recent number matches about 4%, right? So doing pretty good, way better than 2021, 2022. Deflation is whenever the price level goes down. That's deflation. Now inflation is bad. Deflation is even worse. Because what you see with deflation is usually an indicator of a very, very severe economic downturn. So we only had two major deflation in US history. So that was the 2020-2021 recession. And then again, in the Great Depression, 1930s, we had deflation. So one reason because we just don't have enough demand anymore. People don't buy stuff anymore. Therefore, price level goes down. And also something called a hyperinflation. So hyperinflation is anytime you have very, very high inflation. We call that hyperinflation. So different textbooks put a number on it. So some book call this one 50% per month. Other book call this one 200% per year. But it's just that whenever you have a very, very, very high inflation, we call that hyperinflation. So if you look at the example used at the beginning of the chapter, Zimbabwe had a hyperinflation. And also, if you remember your world history class, what happened in Germany in 1930s before the guy with the mustache become chancellor, there was also very high inflation in Germany. In those years, inflation was so bad that many people prefer to, when they go out to eat, they prefer to eat first. They prefer to pay first, then eat. Because if you eat then pay, price will be higher, right? Literally, price was increasing by the hour. And then for many employees, they want to be paid twice per day. Not twice per month, it's twice per day. So you do half day work, get your half-day pay, and then you don't have a lunch break, you have a spending break. You can take your half-day pay to go buy whatever you need, because otherwise, if you wait until end of the day, price will be higher, and that was a hyperinflation. Now, also what is happening recently in Venezuela, there's also hyperinflation. It's a very, very high inflation economy. All right, so the top chart here shows you our U.S. inflation, our U.S. price level. So as you can see, the U.S. price level is consistently increasing, and then really, went way up since 1970s, right? So that was a very high inflation in U.S. economy. But ever since then, our price level doesn't come down; it's always going up. And if you look at our inflation, right? So these two chart here, they actually, goes hand in hand. Notice very high inflation, we see a higher price level, right? So because a higher price level causes inflation. But inflation is measured annually, so measured against the year before. But our price index is measured historically, collectively, right? So historically, U.S. price level has been increasing. And then one thing to notice about our inflation, notice there was a very, very brief deflation by the end of 2008, early 2009. That was the other very bad recession, and that was called the Great Recession. All right, so for U.S. inflation rate, so if you look at U.S. inflation rate measured against most industrial country, we're actually doing pretty good. U.S., even though recently had a very high inflation due to COVID and also due to supply chain problem, but more than most countries in the world, U.S. has a very, very stable price level. So much so that U.S. dollar still is the preferred currency to be held by many other countries. Because otherwise, if your U.S. has a very, very high inflation, then your money is worth less. Then most other economies wouldn't hold on to U.S. dollar anymore because they'll lose value. But if you look at other economies, so we had Brazil, US, and Russia, and especially Russia, notice this, very, very high inflation for Russia. So for many developing countries, the inflation still tend to be a big problem for those countries. So for US, we're doing okay, but for other countries, this can be a big, big problem. All right, so for our inflation, depends on different variables. If your other variable, such as your income, your wage, your other prices, if they don't move hand in hand with inflation, then a difference in the movement between the variables can cause little problems for a consumer and business. So 3 different problems. We can have unintended redistribution of purchasing power, blurred pricing signals, and also difficulty in long-term planning. So first, the unintended redistribution of purchasing power. Whenever you have inflation, different parties in the economy will be impacted differently. So if you are people who are holding on to cash, you're going to be worse off with inflation, because with inflation, that means every other prices are increasing in the economy, but how much cash you have in your hand is fixed. So the buying power of the cash in your hand is getting lower and lower, and therefore you're worse off. And also for any consumer whose financial asset involve nominal interest rate that does not keep up with inflation, right? So for example, let's suppose if you have a saving account, and then your saving account pays you 5% per year. Well, pretty good. But you know what? What if the inflation is 25% per year, right? So if you put your money in the bank for 1 year, it goes up by 5%, but by the time you get the money out, everything else in the economy is all 25% more expensive now. So how much you can buy is actually decreased because inflation moves faster than your interest rate. And also for most workers, your wage tend to lag behind inflation. So it's always that inflation happens first, and then wage will change accordingly, right? So when it first happened, then many workers will be worse off because their income is fixed, but the price level is increasing. And lastly, for any retirees who are on fixed pension, so how much money they're getting from the pension account, the retirement fund is fixed. It doesn't change, but with inflation, they're worse off. Now, there will be people who are better off. So whenever inflation happened, for anybody who has a fixed interest rate, they are better off, right? So right now, we have a very little high interest rate, but that was due to inflation. But for anybody who bought a house, let's say being 2021, 2022, who had a fixed interest rate, they are very much better off now, right? So there are a lot of people who bought a house, let's say in 2001, who paid a 3% interest rate, but right now, interest rate for a new home might be like 7% interest rate, right? So people who bought a house before, they're better off because they paid a very low interest rate. All right, so another variable we can look at is our unemployment, the unemployment benefit. So right now, our unemployment, no, our minimum wage benefit. So right now, minimum wage is measured at 725 federal level. So we changed that back in 2010, but we haven't updated since 2010. But inflation happens, right? So with inflation and our minimum wage is fixed. So if you look at this number since 2010, the real income of anybody who is making minimum wage is actually decreasing now because their wage is constant, but the price level is increasing, so they can buy less stuff with the money they have. And also, if you adjust our minimum wage according to our inflation, the minimum wage in 1960 is actually way higher than the minimum wage today, right? So for anybody who was making minimum wage back in 1960s, they're worse off in 2023. All right, so also inflation can cause a blurred price signals because for many business, we do rely on price signal to see how much our demand is and therefore make our decision accordingly. So imagine if I'm a business owner and then I can sell my stuff more expensive now. Well, that's good. That means consumer like my stuff. So what do? I make more of it, right? So my business decision is based on how much consumer are paying for my stuff. But what if there's inflation going on, right? So maybe the change in price level, the change of the stuff I sell, the price is increasing. It's not because the people like it more, but just because of inflation, right? So how do I distinguish between inflation and just how much people like my stuff? Lastly, inflation can cause a problem for any long-term planning. So if you try to make a long-term investment, try to borrow money for long-term, then inflation can definitely make an impact of your long-term decision planning process. So for a lot of business, they tend to stay away from long-term commitment due to inflation issue. And also, if you look at our US inflation rate and US productivity, that every time there's a high inflation, it tends to go with a very low productivity. But when you have low inflation, we tend to see high productivity, right? So it almost feels like that our inflation and productivity goes in the opposite directions. So a couple of things company can do and also consumer can do to lessen the impact of inflation is to use index automatic adjustment for inflation. So the first one is very well known. It's called a cost of living adjustment. It's also known as COLA. So for a lot of companies, by end of the year, they don't give people a raise. They give people a COLA. So imagine that, it's end of the year, you go talk to your boss and boss says, hey, I like you. I'm going to give you a 3% raise. That 3% is not a raise. That 3% is just try to keep up your wage according to inflation. So when the inflation in the economy goes up, then your wage also goes up. That's called a cost of living adjustment. So you're just the same as before. And also something called an adjust rate mortgage. So it's not popular today, but it used to be very popular in the old days. That many homeowners, they don't have a fixed rate mortgage. They have a floating rate mortgage. So how much interest they pay on the mortgage is floating, depends on the market interest rate. And lastly, our government have similar strategies try to prevent this inflation impact on the U.S. economy. So for one, our U.S. income tax code at the top portion. So for people who are making a lot of money, their tax, how much they pay for the tax, the different level is also determined automatically adjusted for inflation, right? So therefore, those people, those higher income tax earners, whenever inflation goes up, their tax dollar, the tax bill, is also changed accordingly. And we also have COLA that's based on CPI for many Social Security benefit. So for people who are retired, who are depending on the Social Security benefit or even Medicare, their benefit is adjusted automatically whenever the inflation going up. And lastly, that our U.S. government bond, so all the money we borrow from other investors, other countries, they might also be a floating interest rate component involved as well. Therefore, that interest rate is adjusted for inflation. So for anybody who is interested in studying finance, you're gonna hear a lot of something called a LIBOR plus one, LIBOR plus two. That term LIBOR, that's the it's called a risk-free interest rate that's determined by the international financial market. It's usually in London, and that plus one plus two, the plus one plus two is how much the real cost of the loan is. That's the profit or the expenses that whenever there's inflation going up. But that's for finance discussion. Okay, so for now, just know the U.S. government, we also have a floating payment. Some of the bond have a floating payment on the interest rate. All right, guys, that's it for this chapter. Have any question? Let me know. I'll see you guys for chapter 23. Bye bye.